Good morning to you all, and thank you once again for joining us on our Shifting Blame series. My name is Princess Ewina Indum, and I'm the coordinator for the American Spaces at American Canada Global at Mobile Web Ghana. Happy New Month, and let's have a wonderful time today. And American Spaces provides access to current and reliable information about the United States through its book collections, internet access, events, and activities for everyone. Today, our conversation is centered on the topic framing of issues related to gender-based violence by the media and the successes and failures of policy interventions. Facilitating this discussion is Gina Abna Amedika, and I want to read a short bio about who she is. And so Gina is a communications consultant with over 5 years experience in the communication industry. She currently works as the research assistant to the Deputy Minister for Lands and Natural Resources and Member Parliament for Takwa in Swayam. She is a founder of a communications consultancy, MCP Services Ghana, which provides communications consulting services to companies both home and abroad, especially to foreign companies seeking to invest in the Ghanaian economy. Again, Gina is a founder of a non-governmental organization called Alma Africa, which advocates for girl-child education and women empowerment. In the past 2 years, Alma Africa has collaborated with other NGOs in other West African countries, such as Nigeria, Benin, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and Cameroon, to reach out to young ladies with critical issues facing women, such as gender-based violence and the culture of rape. Gina looks forward to actively engaging in enacting policies that seek to empower women. And so this is our facilitator for today. And so thank you all once again for joining in today's discussion. And so now I'll hand it over to Gina. But before that, please ensure that if you have questions, do send it in the comment section below and they will be addressed. Thank you. Hello, Gina. Over to you now.
Hello, Princess. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you for having me. I want to welcome our listeners as well. And I'm looking forward to us having a very engaging session. It's always a pleasure discussing issues that are of paramount interest to women and that seek to foster the growth of women. And talking about or discussing the framing of issues related to gender-based violence, and also going ahead to consider the successes or failures of certain policy interventions by government. It's always an exciting thing to discuss. So I look forward to hearing from also our listeners online joining us to chip in their own thoughts as well, so we can all have that really cohesive discussion. Again, as Princess said, my name is Gina, and these are my social media handles. You can follow me so we can continue and collaborate and do great things that seek to impact women positively. This morning, we're here to discuss issues related to framing of gender-based violence, but it's always important to have a background to what gender-based violence actually is. I'm sure we all have a fair idea of what it entails. According to the UNHCR, gender-based violence happens to be the harmful acts directed at a person because of the gender. And usually, the misconception associated with gender-based violence is that it has to do with violence against women. But it's important to indicate that gender-based violence is not solely violence targeted against women, but violence targeted against both men and women. However, it's important to note that comparatively, women tend to be the targeted victims, the most targeted in terms of victims when it comes to gender-based violence, and tend to be at the receiving end of these actions. About 30% of women globally which amounts to about 736 million women worldwide, have been subjected to either physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. In Ghana, 31% of women have faced at least one form of domestic violence, according to DOFSU. This statistics was just taken 2 years ago. This gives us a fair idea of the severity of the problem associated with violence against women. Because usually these activities are seen as occurrences around us, but they are not seen in a very generic forms, which actually puts out the severity with which the severity of the problem and its associated consequences. That's not to say that men also do not suffer some forms of violence. Actually, according to the Dutch Artsbelt International 2020, about 3.4% to 20.3% of physical domestic violence worldwide are committed against men. In Ghana, according to DOFSU, from the year 2017 to 2018, violence against men have shot up from 18% to 20%, which is a really alarming increase. This generally paints a certain worrying picture to all of us that the occurrence is not only severe or doesn't seem to be problematic against women, but on the whole, generally, there seems to be a problem, and there seems to be a continuous increase in violence perpetrated against both men and women. However, it's important to note comparatively that these activities or these forms of violence, women tend to be more of the victims. For example, in 2011, 15,000, an estimated cases of 15,495 were reported domestically in Ghana. 13,021 of them were against women, as compared to 2,474 of such cases being perpetrated against men. This seems to give us a clear disparity in terms of the actions against women and its consequences being borne by women as compared to men. So when we talk about empowering women and we seem to be a bit more loud about initiating certain policies and actions that would seem to prevent domestic violence or gender-based violence against women. These actions or these campaigns are not out of the blue. They are as a result of the alarming rate of these perpetrations against women, which of course need to be dealt with. What are the forms of gender-based violence? Gender-based violence are perpetrated in various forms. Psychological violence could be a form, sexual harassment is a form, physical abuse is a form of gender-based violence as well, sexual abuse in the form of rape or defilement, child marriages or betrothals are also forms of gender-based violence, and also some really harmful cultural practices such as female genital mutilation, trochosy, and other forms of harmful cultural practices that seek to impede the progress of women. What is the impact of gender-based violence? The impact of gender-based violence, even though it's felt or experienced in various forms, can mostly be narrowed down into critical areas: the physical impact and the psychological impact. Physically, it could lead to certain defects on the body of the victim, or even in certain cases, in the death of the victim. In terms of the psychological defects, victims tend to be depressed, leading to some victims committing suicide if help is not sought or help is not given readily. How do we prevent or how do we stop gender-based violence? Of course, we need to create awareness. There's a lot being done already internationally and locally, both by the government and various CSOs and private partnerships. However, we could all do more to create awareness about gender-based violence, especially against women, highlighting the dire consequences associated with these actions. Education is also key. It's also a key preventive measure to working or speaking against gender-based violence, issues related to gender-based violence. Education, not only in the formal setting, but also in the informal setting, where the civic education routes could be used in educating individuals, whether those not in a very formalized system. So no one is new to the idea of the consequences involved. How do we prevent gender-based violence? One key preventive measure would be to have very strong legal frameworks that serve as punitive measures and disincentives against actions of gender-based violence. Now we focus now on the framing of gender-based violence by the media. Why is it important to even consider how a news item is reported? Why is it relevant? The way an issue is portrayed or reported is critical to the importance attached to it by the audience. It's critical to forming the biases that the audience might have associated with the report. And also it's essential to bringing up the conversation of preventive measures, which would whip up the interest and support from the public. So for example, if a news item is reported passively or not given the attention needed, of course, the audience will not flag that information as essential. But if it's given the needed central attention, it becomes a national discourse and paints a picture of importance in the minds of the audience. Now, critical perspective on how media framing informs audience interpretation. It's essential to know that how a news item is reported informs the interpretation of the audience, how they understand it, how they even portray its importance, and how the biases even form associated with it. And even the process of selection of that news item is also important. While reporting the issue, was it given the front page report, or was it docked behind the scenes and given a 10-second attention somewhere in between the reporting? It's also critical. It's also important to note that the salience of an issue, salience in a sense of the frequency of occurrence. So the frequency with which an issue is reported, the frequency with which the importance is attached to that particular issue goes a long way to inform the importance to which the general populace or the audience will attach to that particular news item. So it's important to note that the frames, the way it's couched, the information is couched, will feed the interpretation and the biases of the audience. The selection process, which is where that news item is placed, would also be important. It's also important to informing the audience about the relevance of the news item or the severity of the problem, and also the salience. So these three, the salience or the frequency with which that particular issue is trampled upon or talked about, also informs the importance in the minds of the audience. So the way it's couched, the process of selection, and the salience, these three are key in reporting any issue at all, and gender-based violence is no exception. According to some plethora of studies actually sampled, which focused on the Daily Guide, the Daily Graphic, the Ghanaian Times, the Peace FM Online, My Joy FM Online, the Ghana News Agency. These are all really popular news portals in Ghana. Now, a study was done on how these news portals report on gender-based violence. I am going to break down, or I'm going to separate the frames on how gender-based violence against women was reported, and how gender-based violence against men were also reported. So we focus on frames of women. It was realized that most of the news items on gender-based violence concerning women were reported as episodic or an individual happening somewhere, as compared to linking that particular situation to a general thematic occurrence of gender-based violence, the general umbrella of gender-based violence. The issue is just reported as a one-off occurrence. For example, it's reported a woman in Kumasi has been assaulted by her husband. End of story. We've heard about it. It's just a piece of information thrown out there, and that's the end of it. Whereas it could have been reported as a woman has been assaulted by her husband, and this actually contributes, or this falls under the generic problem of gender-based violence, which the government is fighting against. You could tell the differences in the report if it was reported in a thematic way, if it was linked to a general or broader spectrum. It could be linked to it could actually it could actually highlight the importance of the problem and the severity of it, bringing in the fact that it's a general problem being focused on government as well. But that's not the case. Over 90% of the issues were just reported as an episodic or an individual happening. And that doesn't drive home importance if in the minds of audiences, if any news item should be carried out in that particular manner. Another important frame that was realized during the study was victim blaming. These may not be direct, but were usually inferred. So, for example, a news item carries the story, a woman who was with her boyfriend is accusing him of rape. You have not necessarily directly blamed the victim, but you have inferred that by including her location at the time of the occurrence. So those inferences go a long way to suggest that the victim is being blamed, and also may form certain biases in the minds of the audiences who are the end users of the information, and actually douses the level of importance that should be attached to the issue of gender-based violence against women. Another frame that was really salient was the exoneration of perpetrators. That tone was evident in especially the local news portals, who seemed to, during their reporting, in a way exonerate the perpetrators. Or a woman who, works as a sexual, works as, for the want of a better word, a hooker is accusing a man of rape, or accusing a man, or for example, in some of the rape stories that I read during the research, you realize it says, it used the term, the man was unable to control his sexual desires. Using that term, unable to control his sexual desires, is indirectly exonerating the person, indicating that he's unable or has an inability, a certain inability of self-control, which should not be the case in terms of professional reporting, and a certain report that should trigger a response from both the public and government. Another frame which was worrying, that was salient was a commodification of women. So you would find, especially when the perpetrator happens to be an intimate partner or a husband, the frames were usually such that it's reported that the woman is married to the man. But the fact that she's married to him, or the fact that he might have paid her bride price, doesn't make her a commodity or an item he bought off the shelf at a supermarket. The woman in question is a human being with her own inalienable rights. So these were some of the frames used, or these were the salient frames that ran through the reporting on gender-based violence against women, which are worrying. It's a worrying trend because it actually limits the desire of, or that interest, or that critical and essential campaign to drive home the consequences associated with gender-based violence, and also to try to put in place preventive measures. Reporting in these shapes or form do not project gender-based violence against women as serious issues that ought to be dealt with. And if the audience or the public that should serve as a support unit in fighting or advocating for this campaign do not see it as an important or a salient issue, then the fight against it in itself is not going to hold. So there ought to be certain changes in the reportage. We'll focus now on the frames for men. In reporting on gender-based violence against men, it's realized that most of these reportage came in a very comic form. It almost suggests as if you're making fun of the men for being abused. The men who equally are human beings, but I mean, these are some of the frames. Most of the frames, actually, over 90% of them, came in the form of a comic reportage. Also, some of the frames appeared to be or captured it as an unusual occurrence. And one would actually infer that due to the comic nature of reporting on gender-based violence against men, some men are reluctant, or most men are reluctant to report it. So one of the frames actually captured, sees or projects the entire reportage as an unusual occurrence. And some of them also project them as an elephant in the room, something that nobody wants to talk about, or most men don't want to talk about, but this man has come up to talk about it. But why should it even be captured that way? He's reported that he's been assaulted, and that should be the silver line. He's been assaulted. But once you go out of your way to indicate during the reports that it's not usually done, but he has done it, it's as if to say that he's not being as strong as other men. And that might not necessarily empower other men to go ahead to voice out these challenges once they experience them. What are some of the factors that feed these frames? It's important to note that our culture or our cultural orientation plays a significant role in how these frames, or how the news items are framed. Of course, our cultural setting is patriarchal. So it's the notion or the suggestion is the man is supposed to be the head and is supposed to be the strongest of both. So a woman is supposed to be malleable, subservient, and not necessarily be as empowered. So women, of course, in the frames, women who tend to be tough and got abused in the process. Some of the reports are nuanced in a way to suggest that a woman is supposed to be humble. I mean, probably that's why you've been assaulted. So some of these cultural orientation indirectly or vicariously feeds into these reportages. In the way feeds into the way the news items are couched. because like it or not, these news portals or these news items being put together are being put together by individuals who are equally viewing the issues through certain cultural lenses. And through certain cultural lenses, cultural orientation and cultural understandings, however enlightened they are. And so unfortunately, these are some of the challenges or the frames that the factors that feeds into the framing of the issues as they are. Then there's also the social orientation, and the way we're groomed socially to indicate that men are supposed to be stronger, men are supposed to be tough enough to handle certain pressures. And so a man will be reluctant, the news portals or writers will be seen through that lens in reporting. So for example, while reporting on a man being abused, the social lenses could be a blinding factor to being professional or critical in reporting in cases like this. What's the way forward? The way forward would be to educate the media or to have constant workshops to educate the media on reporting on gender-based violence. It is important to let the media understand that they're gatekeepers between the public and issues of importance. The way the media carries an issue goes a long way to influence and inform the importance to which the public attaches to that issue or that problem. So it's important to be able to bring the media to a place of reporting on these issues with a level of professionalism and importance needed. So education of the media is critical. Also, most media houses have specific desks for business news, specific desks for economic issues, specific desks for sports issues, but there's almost zero to none for issues related to gender-based violence. It will be important to have a desk dedicated to reporting on gender-based violence, which would allow for a proper professional reportage and also go a long way to prevent the episodic or individualistic nature of the stories, and allow for each story to be carried out in a very, again, thematic way. Each story be linked to a general picture. A typical example being recently, some young boys were sodomized by their teacher in the northern region. And around the same time, a young lady in the Volta region, a young girl, was defiled by an elderly man in the Volta region. And both stories were carried out or made the news item for that evening on the same news portal. And what I realized was they initially reported on the issue of sodomy in the northern part of the country, ended it, and now took this news item of the young lady who's been raped in the Volta region also as a separate issue. Then we move on to other stories. What would have been the best case is to have realized that both issues fall directly under the gender-based violence framework, and so could have been reported and later linked and paid for that broader picture to have been painted. That way, it would have carried a lot more weight, a lot more attention, and also exposed a lot of people to the various forms of gender-based violence there are. But reporting on them individually then leaves it a bit light and doesn't really portray or doesn't really push that level of importance as needed. So it'll be very important to also report on these issues in a very thematic way. We focus now on the policy interventions. And in the policy intervention, I had to break them down into the legal, the policy frameworks, and then we look at the structural framework as well. So we talk about gender-based violence, the importance of curtailing these challenges. But it begs the question, is it just a conversation, or are there structures or proper plans being put in place to ensure that these actions are not only brought to book but prevented on the whole. And successive governments in Ghana have done their bit. Globally, there's been a lot of campaign, a lot of conversation from the UN level, the 16 days of activism to raise awareness. It gives us a broader picture that from a global perspective down to a local level, there's that intentional stride to put into place policy interventions to prevent gender-based violence as a whole. In Ghana's case, the legal provisions in the 1992 Constitution, we have the Police Service Act, the Criminal and Other Offences Act, Act 29, which was enacted in 1960, the Children's Act of 2003, and then there's a Domestic Violence Act, which is now enacted in 2007. These are the legal provisions in the 1992 Constitution that backs the legal redress or any legal action against gender crimes associated with gender-based violence in Ghana. As I mentioned earlier on, to be able to assert any form of success in this fight against gender-based violence, the implementation of the legal framework is really important. So but you cannot prevent what you do not have. So having these legal provisions, which form or which serves as the fundamentals to the fundamental punitive measures or the fundamental yardstick to which any perpetrator will be held accountable is essential. So kudos to the government for continually reviewing these bills and acts and ensuring that they're comprehensive enough to cater for these challenges associated with gender-based violence. In terms of policy, in 2015, they enacted the National Gender Policy, which seeks to mainstream gender equality and women's empowerment into Ghana's development. This framework or policy framework is a really critical document to have, because then it serves as a guide to that the guide that links the women's development in general to Ghana's development, to fuse the development of women generally into the total agenda of the development of Ghana. This focuses on the rights of women, the justice, leadership, accountability, gender roles, economic opportunity for women are all stipulated in the National Gender Policy, which is a critical document that the successive government should be applauded for not only having, but using that or allowing the policy to serve as a guide towards empowering women and ensuring that it becomes that guiding principle towards ensuring the inclusiveness of women in the developmental agenda of Ghana. And there's also between the 2009 to 2018 National Plan and Policy Action, which was a study spearheaded by the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection. There was a 10-year study of a national plan and policy action to make sure that there's an inclusiveness in terms of gender and opportunities associated with women and all. I included the State Protection Act because it's essential to understand that there's a policy that seeks to protect women against gender-based violence. The State Protection Act, especially from Act 11 to 16, clearly stipulates the protections, being made available by government to victims of gender-based violence, especially women, where government is not only in the position to provide shelter, but also psychosocial support, some funding to ensure the protection of women, because it was always the issue of women having to go back home to live with their the perpetrators of gender-based violence against them, because a huge percentage of gender-based violence activities are perpetrated by intimate partners. And so the state protection order, it has been a very important policy framework to have. Unfortunately, not all women know that they are entitled to the state protection order at all. Most people don't even know about it. So in cases where they go ahead to report cases of gender-based violence against them, they do not readily assess or request for protection. They seem to be left on their own, or assume they are left on their own. But the State Protection Order makes room or makes provision for psychosocial support, for shelters, and also for some level of support until the case is properly dealt with and the individual is in a better state to be able to move on with her life. We focus on the structural framework. We mentioned the policy or the legal framework. If you look at the policies that are guarding, or the policies enacted to guard against gender-based violence and also to manage the situation. Now we're looking at the structural framework. So we've looked at the policy, we've looked at the legal. Now let's look at the structures in place. One of the main structures has to do with the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection. The Ministry of Gender and Social Protection used to be the Ministry for Women and Children's Affairs, but it was working under a very limited umbrella where it simply focused on women and child affairs and was not comprising of people with disabilities, the minor groups, and even men, which is one of the main reasons why its mandate was expanded. And its mandate was expanded to include the persons with disabilities, the equality of both men and women, children's rights, and other forms of marginal groups, such as aged women and men and all that. This actually gives the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection a broader spectrum to operate within. And it also has a number of agencies operating under it. So we have the social welfare. Social welfare is a very important agency operating in Ghana, working with both the government and private sector to ensure that welfares of social issues, issues related to gender-based violence, violence against men, violence against women, and defilement, rape are all dealt with. And also the social welfare also provides some form of training for individuals in both private and public sectors working hand in hand or working in line of advocacy against gender-based violence. Another department under the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection happens to be the Domestic Violence Secretariat, which was enacted to ensure that issues related to gender-based violence and domestic violence as a whole are catered for. Then there's the Gender-Based Violence Command Center. So generally, the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection had its mandate expanded to be able to not only cater for solutions or cater for problems associated with women and children, but also men, and also now have a strong mandate to deal with issues associated with domestic violence and gender-based violence. And all of these, or these respective departments under the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection have been critical in enforcing the success so far. There's also the Domestic Violence Victim Support Unit, DOVSU, which is operational in about 97 locations nationwide. And DOVSU is actually an arm of the Ghana Police Service, so operates under the Ghana Police Service. So with those joining us who are not Ghanaians, if in any case of gender-based violence or domestic violence, the initial channel of reports will be to the police, but the police will refer you to DOVSU. Is the arm of the police service that deals directly or just focuses solely on gender-based violence and domestic violence issues. And their operations have been decentralized in such a way that their operations are visible in about 97 locations throughout the country. So wherever you are in the country, there should be an office of DOFSU where you could report any issue associated with gender-based violence or domestic violence. And instituting this particular department has been extremely critical to dealing with gender-based violence in Ghana, because not all countries seeking to buttress or seeking to deal with issues related to gender-based violence have a well-structured organization such as this to deal with these issues. But DOFSU has been very instrumental. It's been a very critical institution enacted by the government to be able to drive the successes in terms of the fight against gender-based violence. The judiciary is also one of the arms of government that has had its fair share of contribution. The gender courts in Accra, Kumasi, and certain parts of the northern Ghana that focus solely on trying issues related to gender-based violence and domestic violence. This is to accelerate the rate of processes in terms of seeking justice, seeking redress, and all. And because some of the challenges associated to initial judicial processes had to do with the very lethargic and slow methods associated with dealing with cases of gender-based violence. And so one of the successes chalked in these later years has been the allocation of gender courts, which focuses primarily on dealing with issues related to gender-based violence. The CSOs, the private sector, such as organizations such as myself, have been critical also in contributing. So it's very interesting to see how the government of Ghana has been able to string or has been able to have a strong interrelation between policy, structure, and also the legal frameworks, and also to be able to have these respective frameworks work in a very correlated manner. So if the issue, for example, is reported to the DOFSU works it out, provides support for the unit, refers them to the gender courts fast tracks or works with seeking redress for these associated victims, whilst the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection also plays that supervisory role, where the CSOs also play a critical role in raising or continually raising awareness on issues related to gender-based violence. What have been the successes so far? In analyzing all the documents and researching and all that, and even whenever I have the opportunity to speak about it, I always say that for me, one of the major success stories of policy intervention in Ghana is the fact that our laws even exist. Most countries in Africa who are advocating against gender-based violence do not have the level of legal backing that Ghana has had, or the progress Ghana has had in terms of legal framework that serves as a preventive or disincentive against gender-based violence. The policies have been made available. For example, the national gender policy that Ghana has been able to put together since 2015. Countries such as Sierra Leone and Togo cannot boast of documentations like this, but for Ghana to have this documentation and have it be that liaison between women's development and women's development feeding into the national developmental agenda is super. It's something that we cannot commend the previous government, the successive government as well for continuing with for the continual implementation. Another critical or success that we have has to do with the structural support. We've talked about DOFSU, we've talked about Ministry of Gender and Social Protection, and all the other agencies that exist and work correlationally and interrelationally to ensure that issues related to gender-based violence are not only prevented, but if or when occurred, dealt with, and I initially drew that lineage. So if the issue should happen, DOFSU becomes that initial space for reporting. From DOFSU processes it, provides support, psychosocial support for the victims, now refers them to the gender courts. From the gender courts, once redress is sought, DOFSU continues with their support. The ministry plays that oversight responsibility. The CSOs also there playing the advocacy role. And the structural support in Ghana has been amazing so far. The education has also been very, very key. Education, not only in the formal setting, but the informal setting. The NCCE serves as the National Commission for Civic Education serves as one of the major platforms for educating individuals who are not necessarily in the formalized educational system or structure, educating them on issues such as gender-based violence and other relevant issues, going to the market, speaking to the market women, going to the rural communities, advocating and speaking to them about gender-based violence. And in schools, we've had issues on gender-based violence, domestic violence, infused with the curriculum, which has been critical in educating the young ones about their rights and what the issues are and how to be able to deal with them. What have been the limitations so far? The implementation of the policies to a large extent have been poor. I mean, we've had successes anyway, but it could be better. I talked about the availability or the existence of the legal frameworks, and as well as the policy frameworks. They exist, and it's wonderful to have them. But having them and not implement them does not amount to the success desired. And so some of the limitations have been the ability to implement. So, for example, the government instituted the domestic violence board and secretariat, and also instituted a domestic fund to support the various respective units that deal with gender-based violence. However, since its inception in 2014, the fund has only been used once. It's only been used once since 2014, because there still hasn't been a legislative instrument to back its operations. So then the legal frameworks can exist, but without the legislative instrument, without the proper implementation of it, they become wonderful laws written down in our books, but we will be unable to enforce and implement them. And if you're unable to enforce and implement them, then we don't get the desired results. The slow prosecutorial processes is also one limitation that has to do with the policy intervention. Of course, we do have gender courts in certain regions, about 3 regions tops, but they are not sufficient. We have 16 regions in Ghana. So if we have if we have gender courts in about 3 regions, that's woefully inadequate. It means that issues related to gender-based violence, which are reported to the courts, will still find themselves going through the main court frame system and therefore be subjected to the slow legal processes. And so it's important to be able to, if not have gender courts across the 16 regions, we should at least be able to have certain agency attached to issues related to gender-based violence. There's also the lack of awareness. Most people, as I mentioned earlier, don't even know that they're entitled to the protection order or the Protection Act. Most people do not know what their rights are, They also do not know what the provision of the law in terms of when these issues happen. And so, especially in the very rural areas, we want to deal with these things as family issues. But we should create a lot more awareness to be able to enlighten people of what the laws are and what their alienable rights are indeed as individuals as well. The inadequate structures and support services. We've mentioned the presence of DOFSU and the respective structures that exist, but it's also important to note that one of the main support systems that has been lacking has been the psychosocial support for victims of gender-based violence, as well as certain supports in terms of structures and to shelter the victims while the cases, especially in cases where the perpetrators are intimate partners, while the case is being tried. So imagine being assaulted by your husband, you report him to DOFSU or the police unit, and then he's invited by the police to give a statement, and you both go home. You both go back to the same abode to live in the same home. That which is not the best. So these are some of the limitations, even though the law makes provision for protection order, the implementation of it's lagging. Some of the limitations have also been associated with the lack of inadequate structures and all that would be associated with funding and the unavailability of resources to be able to fund these. We recommend that policies be strengthened, especially policies with regards to women's rights be strengthened, proper or urgent implementation of this, especially with regards to the court processes. Urgency be attached to this, and once the urgency is seen or once it's realized in the public domain, I think that it sends out a very strong indication that to perpetrators that these activities will not go unpunished, because some of the challenges associated with this is most victims even want to report it. To tell you, apart from the fact that they cannot afford the legal representation, the court seems to drag the issue sometimes over years. And so both parties lose interest, or the victim even loses interest in dealing with these issues and would rather move on with her life, his or her life. And so some agency attached to dealing or seeking legal redress will go a long way. The structural adjustment is critical. Adjusting structures to be able to operate, even though as it seems now, as it stands, most of the structures that do exist, from the ministry to DOFSU to the social welfare, all working interrelationally, and it should be restructured in such a way that there's a main structure that deals with the support services, because now it looks like the support services infused with it's under the police service, under the DOFSU, which happens to be the police service. But if the support unit can stand on its own and serve as that psychosocial support unit, that umbrella body operating on its own, it would be really important. Also, the conscious social awareness, the conscious social awareness of the challenge, it's important. And we know about it, but how deliberate has the campaign been so far? Not only about not doing it, but if it happens, what are the processes involved? What does the law say when it happens to you? And how can you seek redress? How can you enforce the Protection Act to make sure that you're well catered for? These are some of the recommendations I think that should be implemented. And then, of course, these are some of the studies used in preparation of the presentation. Thank you. I'm happy to have any question or contribution, and also happy to make the presentation available once you reach out to me on any of my social media, or reach out to me via my social media handles. Thank you very much. Princess, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gina. And this was a very insightful presentation. You've highlighted all the necessary details pertaining to understanding the issues of framing with issues relating to gender-based violence and also the policy interventions, the successes and failures. And so to our viewers watching, and we are now ready for your questions. Start sending in your questions and Gina would address them. Okay. And so, Gina, I'm going to start reading some of the questions that we have here. The first question is asking, would you say comparing, sorry, it said that comparing the number of years of Ghana's independence, would you say that the issue of framing when it comes to gender-based violence is better than as compared to the previous years? And did you get the question, Gina?
Yes, I did. I think that years on years, there's always that room for improvement. And there's been, if you look at the trajectory, there's been a conscious growth plan. There's always been that growth in terms of reporting, not only on gender-based violence, but even if you have to look at a newspaper or a news item from 1957, as compared to a news item of today, you can tell that the channel of reporting, the languages used, the style and all that have all changed. There's been changes to it. But the fact that there have been changes to some progress made does not mean that we can't continually make that or advocate for progress or advocate for professionalism or advocate for the right thing being done. We can always improve upon whatever is being done or whatever we are doing now, which is what we were talking about now, that yes, of course, there's been some, now it's even making way into the news. Now issues related to gender-based violence are seen as a problem because women are standing up, women are speaking. There's been a lot more conversation on women empowerment, women's rights, which wouldn't have been as strong as and as visible as yesteryears. You know, and so it can easily tell you that now there's been a massive improvement, but we are where we are, and how can we improve upon where we are? And that's the conversation. So yes, there's been progress, but we can obviously do more.
Thank you very much, Gina, for the question. And so another question is asking, most of the case, when it comes to reporting on gender-based violence, I would say that the local stations always flout the laws. What would you say about this, Gina?
Okay, I tried so hard to shy away from that while, while presenting, but during the research, I did mention a number of local stations were also sampled. Key among them was Peace FM and Peace FM Online. And the frames from these local stations would shock you, you know, and especially during their live reporting, the reporter is visibly asked, I mean, what was she doing in the man's room in the first place? Why not inviting that activity? But that's not an utterance that should even, those are not words that should even be uttered, you know, by a presenter who's live reporting on an issue or related to gender-based violence. His was supposed to present the issue just as it happened, to be able to throw more light or to educate the general public about the occurrence. But these are some of the challenges associated with the local stations, especially when they're reporting in the local dialect. The visibility of the cultural setting, like I was saying, the cultural orientation becomes particularly clear. That cultural, I beg to even say that it might be associated with the fact that they are reporting in the very local dialect. It could be done professionally from that angle, but once they're they tend to fall into a certain cultural setting where they see through that lens and make those pronouncements, however unfortunate it is. So yes, the local stations, I'll try to shy away from it as much as I possibly could, but the local stations were some of the main perpetrators of these frames.
Thank you, Gina. And it's good that you are basing this on the research that you have carried out. And so a follow-up question with regards to these local media stations, what what interventions does maybe organizations like DOFSU and other organizations, and what do they do when they hear some of these media stations framing stories in an appalling way? What's the way? What step do you take, or what action do you take? Do you call the journalists pointing out their actions, or do you just let it go?
Well, I honestly believe that they should be called out. I mean, DOFSU as an organization can start off by, as I mentioned, education, organizing workshops for these journalists, and also even advocating again that there should be a desk, a particular desk in every news agency or company that reports or focuses solely on gender-based violence. Then just as they have journalists dedicated to sports news, entertainment news, and all that, if we have journalists dedicated to reporting on gender-based violence, then they can be trained. They can be trained to enhance proper reportage on issues related to gender-based violence. But if they are left to episodic or individualistic reporting, that's where the problem stems from. Because then they don't really know how to handle these issues, because these issues are very sensitive. I think that DOFSU should begin with education, then advocacy for a specific desk on reporting on gender-based violence with these news agencies and news portals. Then from then on, we can talk about punitive measures for those who flout these rules and regulations. You could call them to order, because if you haven't trained someone to do something, it's difficult to hold them accountable. And then the question becomes, what's the yardstick, or what's the measure for holding them accountable? Even though we say ignorance of the law is no excuse. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Training can be done. Let's make sure there's that room for that peculiarity. Have that independent desk for reporting on issues. Then now, going forward, we can have a conversation on punitive measures. If those frames pop up anywhere, or they be called to they could actually be called out.
Thank you very much, Gina. I believe that those of us watching are getting enlightened and educated about these recommendations that Gina is giving us. And so Nunana Ado says, thanks, Gina. Relevant and enlightening presentation. I think more deliberate education and awareness creation is very important. The NCC and the media are key to achieving this. Okay, thank you. Another one says, that's bridging development gaps. That's very enlightening. Thank you, Gina. Another comment, I agree with that comment about local stations. Thank you. And there's another comment. The media does play a very important role in raising awareness to the issues of gender-based violence and are necessarily ally. What are the strategies to ensure they get accurate and up-to-date information? That's a good question. Gina, over to you.
He's asking what are the necessary
strategies? Yes.
We get accurate
for the media to produce accurate, yes.
And up-to-date information. Okay, let me first of all appreciate the sender of the question of bridging the gaps. It's an organization I know very well and run by a woman that I admire, Dr. BC. Thank you so much for joining us. The strategies, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to report accurately would require training, education, like I said, consciously training the media, and not just training anyone, but they should have a dedicated desk towards reporting on gender-based violence. The international media, for example, they have a correspondence. This Ukrainian war, for example, there's a specific desk that reports on these issues. I believe CNN will not just call any reporter from any background. If they wanted to address entertainment issues as well, they have specific desks allocated. A desk that speaks on economic issues. Why don't we have a desk that speaks on gender-based violence, considering the figures and seeing the alarming rates, at which it continues to escalate? Why don't we have this both locally and internationally? We should have a specific desk, and those specific desks, or the head of the department, whoever, are trained in line professionally with reporting on issues of this nature, because they cut across physical abuse. They are very psychological. So assuming a lady is raped and then she hears the reporter talking about the fact or asking questions such as, what was she doing in the man's room? How would she even feel as an individual? And how would people around her even see her? Because everybody, that informs a certain narrative then generally. So I believe once the structures have to be put in place, set the desk, let's have a specific desks in the respective media outlets that focuses on gender-based violence reportage. The head of department or whoever is in charge, they're all trained, those under them are all trained. If there's a head of department,
Hello, Gina. So sorry, Gina went off. She'll be joining us shortly. But before she does that, I want to introduce us to an amazing resource that you would find very helpful. And this is the Education Library, the eLibrary USA, the eLibrary USA. And this is a state-of-the-art digital library with a 9 premier electronic databases that includes digital newspapers, magazines, journals, and dissertations. And so usually this resource is available to use, but because of the COVID situation, we are opening up access for people to be able to use this resource. And so if you are interested, the link will be shared in the comments box, and so that you could click on register to have access to the amazing resource. And so you could still send in your questions as we are waiting for Gina. In a few minutes, we'll be wrapping up with today's conversation. And let's not forget that let's continue with advocacy individually or with the various groups we belong to or the organizations we are representing. Let's advocate on how best information on gender-based violence should be framed, and also ensure that we are advocating for policies that would help meet the benefits of women's rights, both women and men's rights and children's rights. And so advocacy starts with us, and let's not limit it to an organization or an individual. And so we are running out of time, and thank you all for joining us today. And this program was brought to you by the U.S. Embassy Ghana, American Ghana, and Global in partnership with Mobile Web Ghana. This concludes our program for today. Kindly follow us on our social media pages, U.S. Embassy Ghana on Facebook and on Twitter, to stay updated of our subsequent programs. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay safe and observe all protocols. Thank you.